Hello, I'm Anawultus, and welcome back to another response video to Rich Deem's Where Young Earth Creationism Gets the Bible Wrong. Let's get back into the action.
Since Genesis indicates God rested from all his creation work. However, unlike the other 6 days, there is no familiar closing. There was evening and morning the seventh day.
And it's very interesting that he chooses to acknowledge the evening and the morning pattern, which for most people reading would imply that it is indeed a night-day cycle that is occurring.
It's just not there. In addition, the book of Hebrews regarding God's seventh day of rest says, "Let us therefore be diligent to enter into that rest." So God's seventh day of rest...
Okay, so let's actually address the third bullet point here. So there is no evening and morning the seventh day. So let's actually look at this here, and let me just switch the screen over. There we go. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So what we have here is very interesting, because if we look in the previous verse, because remember the chapter divisions are a later addition, God saw all the animals, saw all that he had made, and it was very good, and there was evening and morning the sixth day. So, and it has the same pattern throughout all the previous day, evening and morning. And then the verse 1 of chapter 2 is actually bookending what's happening in chapter 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So this is actually a bookend, which means there's a narrative shift that occurs here in verse 1, which is probably why the editor decided to put chapter divisions here. Just a moment, I've got a hair in my mouth. Well, then by the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So, and on the seventh day he rested from all his work. So what we see is that, of course, there's a bit of a bookending to what happened on the first 6 days, which is why people say a 6-day creation. That's why people say that. It's because it is indeed bookended, because it does say it was completed in all their vast array. So the 6 days are completed. Then on the seventh day, a mild narrative shift, not as strong as the narrative shift that occurs in verse 4, when the focus of the book of Genesis changes. So I would still, if I were to make the chapter divisions, I would still consider this part of chapter 1, but that's just me. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. So the question that is brought up is, should this not be considered parallel? Should the word yom, which is translated as day in the English, not be considered parallel to chapter 1's yom, when it talks about the different numbered days, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th? And a general literary rule is that if you're using the same word several times throughout a text, it usually means the same thing, unless you explicitly state that it means a different thing. And I would say that if we assume that evening and morning contextualizes Yom in the first 6 days as being typical days, time periods with day length, day-night cycles, I would say that there's no problem In fact, it would be, from a literary standpoint, correct to assume that verse 2 in Genesis 2 is indeed also speaking of a similar period of length. And the reason it doesn't use evening and morning is because there's a slight narrative shift, since the active creation of a world has been completed in verse 1. So that's just a rough explanation as to why I think Moses decided not to put that in there. I'm not saying that he would have put it in there to imply it, but again, generally, since we know that the historical position that most people throughout history adhere to is that these are exact days of creation, then I don't see a reason why Moses would have had to put the idea that this has an evening and a morning on the seventh time, since people would naturally assume that by reading the text in parallel. It's sort of similar to Exodus 20 when this actually comes up again. Exodus 20. And I'm actually going to get a parallel Westminster Leningrad Codex. Luckily, I had set this up previously. So this is the Ten Commandments, and this is a Hebrew rendition of that. So we're going to look at, remember, the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. And of course, if we actually look at the Westminster Leningrad Codex, we do see that the term Yom appears. So, for example, this is Yom in verse 10 here. This here is Yom, and that's referring to this day right here. And then if you look at verse 11, for me it's a bit harder to read with the markings on it. I generally prefer just the straight up consonant. Here's I think that's Yom. And so what I'm essentially saying here is that throughout here, the word used to refer to the different days of a week is indeed the same word used in the very next verse to refer to creation. And remember, this is made by the same author who did indeed write down and chose to use the word Yom when he wrote about the creation narrative. So we see that Moses himself is not actually recontextualizing the word Yom to mean a different thing from these different verses when he's talking about the Shabbat. So what that means is that if we assume that the word Yom does indeed mean day, that he is indeed saying that the days of creation are indeed the same types of days as the days in the week. And of course, he is referring to God's rest on the seventh day as a past tense event, just like Genesis. Let me close that. Just like Genesis 2 is referring to it as a past tense event. So let's actually get into this, because Rich Deem is actually going to discuss this idea a little bit further.
Rest is ongoing, even today, having lasted at least several thousand years.
Okay, so this is actually very interesting, because the first time I heard this, it sounded very strange to me, to assume that the seventh day had not concluded, because it is indeed referred to in past tense, as God rested, not God now rests the seventh day, which I think is very weird. So let's actually look at the context of Hebrews 4, 4 through 11, or maybe just Hebrews 4 in general, just to make sure that what he's talking about is actually talking about creation. So Hebrews chapter 4. Okay. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. That's very interesting. The promise of entering his rest. What could that mean? Well, you may ask, where in the Bible does God promise to give people rest? Well, it actually occurs in Exodus. So Exodus 12, Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people," Exodus 33:12, just to give you a good reference, "lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" So the promise here is that the Lord, that Yahweh here, is going to go with his chosen people in his presence, and that he will then give them rest. And this is the rest that God gives. Therefore, it is his rest. But the question is this referring to who's the one that's resting here? That's the question. The answer is it's not God that is resting here. It is his people that are resting here. And therefore, entering into God's rest is to be in a state where God is present with you, and because you are safe, God is with you, you can rest, and you don't need to be alert. But let's actually go to Hebrews to expand on the context. Hebrews chapter 4. Okay, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it, for we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, "So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall enter my rest." And footnote B, this is Psalm 95:11. So Psalm 95. "So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways." So this is, of course, referring to the people of Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. And he then declared that they would not enter his rest. So in this context, what is the rest that God gives? It is entering into the promised land and therefore prospering in it. Entering into the promises that God has given to you. So in that context, it is to enter his rest also does not refer to the rest of creation. So Hebrews chapter 4 again. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest, and yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. So now it actually mentions creation. For somewhere he had spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his works. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Shabbat rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. So entering God's rest is to rest from your works, just as God did. Okay, remember, past tense, from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by proclaiming their example of disobedience. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of a heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. So the question is, does this mean that do any of these verses imply that the seventh day of creation is in some way not concluded? The answer is no, they do not imply that. Because the rest for the people of God is different from the rest that God himself enters on the seventh day. Because this is a rest that God has given to the people, and the other one is a rest that God has given to himself. And so to enter into his rest is not to join God in a rest that he is actively taking, but it is to enter into a situation where God is allowing you to rest. Because we know God is alive and active. He's working. How is he working? Well, we see a parallel between creation and the Holy Week, for example. The first day, Jesus, having been anointed as in Bethany, now rides into Jerusalem as a king. And then throughout the week, he preaches in Jerusalem. On the fifth day, okay, on the fifth day, there's a sacrifice made, which is then used on the sixth day, on the Friday, the day of preparation, as it is called in Greek, which means Friday in Greek. On that day, Jesus himself is sacrificed, and what happens on the cross? He creates man once again. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that we are become a new creation. We are born again. And how is this happening? Because our sin, we are crucified with Christ, and his righteousness is put onto us. And therefore, we are a new creation. And therefore God creates man on the 6th day, and on the 7th day he is dead, he is in his grave, he is physically in a state of rest, and then on the 8th day he rises up again and continues to walk the earth. So we see a cycle that has a beginning and it continues. It has the 7th day where he rests, and on the 8th day what happens? He resumes again. And what I'm not saying is that God continued creating his physical creation on the 8th day after the 7th day, because we know that his physical creation was complete on the 6th day. But what I am saying is that just as with man, the week that God has given Moses, there is a beginning and there is an end to the week. And then after the end, a new week resumes. Just like that, just like man's week has a 7th day that then has a conclusion, the week of God also has a conclusion on the 7th day. And that's why throughout all the Bible, it refers to the 7th day of creation in past tense. Why? Because it has concluded. So let's continue.
Young Earth Dogma says the creation days were exactly 24 hours long.
And again, that's a bit of an exaggeration, because number one, there's no unified Young Earth creationist dogma, and number two, a lot of people wouldn't say 24 hours, but I do admit it is a pretty cliche thing to say. So again, when I say it's not 24 hours, what I'm not saying is that I'm a day age person. What I'm saying is that as someone who understands various scientific concepts, I understand that days aren't always 24 hours. That's what I'm saying.
Long. However, the Bible clearly indicates that at least 3 of the days were longer than 24 hours.
And again, that's really... You're not really debating against the Yom here. What you're debating is saying that the Yom is different because you think that something would need more time to occur when we're talking about an almighty being, when I say that the context does indeed show that it is a typical day.
When forced to choose between their dogma and the Bible, Young Earth creationists reject the Bible.
Alright, so let's stop here and we'll commence again. Now, as always, if you are interested in correcting a mistake that I may have made, I am happy to receive criticism. If I've jumped the gun on something and I am informed, I will retract the statement. I will amend the statement, because as someone who is not dogmatic on many of these issues, I would say that I am indeed open of mind to change my mind if evidence is given that contradicts a statement that I have made. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.